So we're gonna talk about Ohlins and some of our different track packages and touring packages that we have for Ohlins. So one of the questions we get a lot of is, why Ohlins? Why not KW or Bilstein, BC Racing, whatever? And a lot of it comes down to the quality of the product itself. We can sell all those things. Some of them have better profit margins on them, and because they're lower priced on a whole, we could probably sell a lot more of them. But those aren't products that we typically want to sell. So one of the big advantages of Ohlins depends on the application, but take a Porsche for example. Ohlins decouples the ride height in the coilovers from the spring preload. So when we corner balance the car, we can do that through spring preload or through ride height adjustment to actually shift weight around in the car and get the cross corners correct on it. Most other coilovers, especially Bilstein and KW, they do not have ride height adjustment except through spring preload. So it can create some wonkiness in terms of ride quality, especially if you don't want your car super low. I think both of those companies make good products. This isn't a video bagging on those guys, but these are reasons why we choose Ohlins over those guys. And so there definitely are Ohlins applications that do not have decoupled spring preload and ride height adjustment, but Porsches, Subarus, all the BRZ platforms, some BMWs, not all, and a number of other applications do it as well. And then there's a few older BMW applications like our E36 that does not have separate independent ride height and preload adjustment. But back to Porsches, because we have that ability to do that, we can set the ride height exactly where we want it and without jacking a bunch of preload into the car. So if we don't want the car really low, no problem. We just raise it up and then we set the preload to 2 millimeters, which is their default spec, and it works really well. You still get really good comfort and you get the exact ride height you want. So that's a big benefit. One of the things we do with our track packages is we run quite a bit higher spring rates. And we have different tiers depending on what you're doing with how frequently you go to the track. Is this an occasional track car that you go 2 or 3 times a year? Maybe an off-the-shelf package is totally fine. If you're a little bit more serious about going to the track, but you don't want a race car, our tier 1 track packages work really well. We go out about 15 to 20% in spring rate, and we revalve the shocks to match that. So you still get pretty good ride quality, and oftentimes still better than stock. And really exceptional handling. It's razor sharp, it's awesome. We go up to our tier 2 packages. They're a little more aggressive, less street friendly. You can still drive them on the street, and lots of people do. But it may not be the comfort cruiser you want to take on a 1,000-mile road trip at that point. Our tier 3 packages are generally race car oriented, cars with aero, and we can always do custom packages as well. But we have 3 tiers of default, well-known, we've been doing these for 10 years, valving and spring packages that just work really well. And if you have something custom you want, we're happy to entertain that and work with you on it. We also do the touring packages for applications where you're probably never going to go to the track, and you still can, absolutely, but that's not its intention. Whereas the off-the-shelf road and tracks are designed for road and track, this is more of a road-oriented setup. So we soften the spring rates up, we soften the valving up to or match the valving for the softer spring rates, and you get really good ride quality. And it still handles great. I think it still handles better than stock, but it rides way better than stock. And so for customers that either don't track a lot or they live in areas with rough roads, potholes, frost heaves, stuff like that, or in cities where the road quality isn't great, that's a good option. And it might be that you just want to set the ride height exactly where you want it on the car, and you still want good ride quality, and performance isn't what you're interested in. That's an excellent option. We just did a 997.2 turbo install here with one of our touring packages, and the client was definitely not going to track this car. And so my first thought was an off-the-shelf package is probably fine, but he has some roads he drives on that are pretty rough, and the Bilsteins that were in the car were just unacceptable ride quality on those roads. And so rather than go off the shelf, we wanted the touring package. So in this particular application, we bring the spring rates down 12.5% front and rear. You still keep a nice bias. The car will still rotate nicely, and it still handles fantastic. And you have a lot of range of adjustment on the shock still. So, so that car turned out great, and yeah, like I said, the ride quality is fantastic on it. But it still handles well because it is basically a supercar. The way the Ohlins work is they have standard valving like any shock would, or you can imagine a shock would, but they also have, the adjustment comes from a bleed valve. And that bleed valve adjusts compression, low speed compression and rebound at the same time. And then your medium or moderate speeds are handled by the shim stack and the compression and rebound ports in that. And then for really high speed, you have the dual flow valve, which is pretty unique to road and track coilovers. And so that really helps with ride quality. At the racetrack, like a good example of where the dual flow valve comes into play is when you hit a curb on the racetrack. And I'm not talking about a curb like you'd see on a street. This is an FIA curb that's rounded over, but it's pretty aggressive. If the car's loaded up in a turn when you hit that apex and hit that curb, it can upset it pretty badly. And that could be the difference between the turn sticking and you going off. And so the nice thing with the dual flow valve and just Ohlins in general is when we have a high speed event like that, it handles it really well. Instead of the car getting jarred by it, it absorbs that and passes over it. And one of the things I've noticed with students out on the track, I'll take them out for some laps, maybe my Porsche with our custom Ohlins on it. And they've been avoiding the curbs all day because they have, maybe some BC coilovers or just lowering springs with stock shocks or whatever. And they've been avoiding the curves because they're so harsh when they drive over them. And then I'll cut a turn, apex it, go right over the curb, and they're just like, whoa, I didn't know you could do that. And oftentimes that's the fastest way around a track, but you need suspension that's compliant enough to take it. So that's where the dual flow valve is really nice. So one of the things is, a lot of people want knobs to adjust everything on their shock. They think the more knobs you have, the better it is. And in some respects that is true, but you also need to know how to use the knobs. And compression and rebound are handled in a single knob on the road and tracks or the DFVs. And some people are like, well, I want to adjust them independently. And okay, yeah, but do you know how to do that? And does it actually make a meaningful difference? And that's where having, high and low speed compression, high and low speed rebound, so a double adjustable shock or even a triple, that's where a lot of people just don't know what to do with it. And they don't turn the knobs because they don't know what they do. And so, if you have a professional race team that's supporting you and, they're going to know what to do with it. But for the average track enthusiast, it's usually too much. And a good example is on our race car, we run road and tracks on our E36 Lucky Dog endurance car. They're custom sprung, custom valved, the same treatment we give to all this stuff, but it's the same shock seals, guides, parts that would be in an off-the-shelf kit in terms of quality and longevity. And we go out and we put 200 to 400 hours, race hours on these before we rebuild them. So they have really good longevity. Ohlins makes a great shock called a TTX. It's one of the best in the world. You see them on Formula One cars. I mean, it doesn't really get any better than that. They have super low friction seals in them, and that's one of the reasons they work so well. There's very little stiction in the shock itself, and you don't have drag on the seals, and that translates into really precise valving and control of your spring and the chassis with the shock. But what it also translates into is frequent rebuilds. So we do have street customers that run TTXs, but you're not going to go 50 or 60,000 miles in between rebuilds. You're going to go a couple of seasons of just summer driving, for example. The road and tracks are nice because it uses a full rated street seal kit in it. So these will go 40,000 miles, no problem. I have customers that go way longer than that in between services, and it's not an issue at all. So that's one of the advantages of the Road and Tracks over the TTXs. And besides the fact that they're probably 1/3 of the price. I mean, TTXs are generally anywhere from $8,500 to $12,000 for a set. Depends on the application, but you know, a typical like an E36 or actually an E46 M3, a set of Road and Tracks for that are like $3,000. They're very reasonably priced. That isn't, that's not nothing for sure, but when you compare that to getting a set of mediocre shocks for $1,800 or $2,400, paying a little bit more to get a really high quality shock that you can have valved and set up exactly how you want it, it's a meaningful improvement, and I think it's worth the difference in price. But the nice thing is, on our race car that we run these shocks on, we run 8-hour endurance races, 2 days back-to-back, plus a qualifying session. So it's like 20 hours of race time every weekend that we go race, which ends up being about once a month. When we go out and do these races, I almost never adjust the shocks on the car. The base valving and the spring package is really well suited to the car, and it has enough flexibility to handle a lot of different conditions. We go to tracks that are pretty rough and abusive, like Pacific up in Washington. Sears Point has a few spots that's nice to have good suspension. Laguna Seca is pretty smooth. Ridge is pretty smooth. Portland's in pretty good shape these days. But there's definitely tracks we go to that are pretty rough and abusive, and having a good shock makes that all work. But I don't go and set up the car in the soft mode. I leave the same settings from Laguna Seca to Pacific Raceway to the Ridge to Portland to ORP. It works everywhere, wet or dry. And would there be some benefits to spending a few hours on the test day tuning the shocks in, like precisely to that track? Maybe. You might get a few tenths, but we get 99% of what we can get without ever touching the knobs out of it. And that's the big benefit. So I wouldn't quite call it set and forget, but that's in a lot of ways how I treat it. When my last track day STI, I would drive to tracks all over the West Coast in it. I'd pack my slicks in the back seat and all my tools in the trunk and do a 1,500-mile road trip on my race shocks. They're Road and Tracks with pretty burly springs, custom valving. The setup works awesome. And the only thing I would do is for the drives down, because I'm doing an 8 or 10-hour drive to the track, or maybe even longer, I would set the valving on full soft for the street, just to take a little bit of the abuse out of it. And then depending on the track I'm going to, like if I was going to Reno-Fernley, I'd just leave it on full soft, because that track is super rough, tons of pavement seams, and having the mechanical grip is always what you want. A super smooth track like the Ridge right now, with just having been repaved, there are no bumps or seams or anything in that track. It is perfectly smooth. So you can get away with really stiff suspension there. But that same suspension, if you went to Reno-Fernley, isn't gonna work. So drive down on a road trip, full soft, and maybe I go to Laguna Seca, put the shocks back in the middle, and run all weekend on them, check some tire temps, that's it. And everything looks good, and you don't have to fuss with it. And me, I like going to the track and driving my car. I don't want to go to the track and work on my car. So I really like the benefits of a shock that has the flexibility to get you to the track, put down fast lap times to the track, and then drive you home. And it comes in at a reasonable price point. They last a long time, and we have a lot of options available for quite a few different cars with custom valving and custom spring race, depending on the package, what you're doing with the car, what kind of aero you have. And so I think Ohlins Road and Tracks are probably one of the most flexible shocks you can get at a reasonable price point, and that's why we use them.